So decided that I would crack open this book called The English Cabalah. It's a very interesting book on Kabbalah. It's volume one, by the way. I don't have volume two, so I don't know what secrets may be revealed in volume two. I only have this one volume, but what I have been focusing on when it comes to this book is that it's largely devoted to mathematics and gematria. And so there's a lot of stuff involving numerology that I really am like. This book is so mathematical. Let me try to find. Well, here's a good example. Here's what's called the component parts of the temple, all broken down into gematria, and then breaking down like how the different ones add up to each other, for instance. So, like, for instance, we have the Great Court equals 161, which also equals what the gematria is for the Hanged Man plus U. Now, this gematria is for the English language. There's gematria for English and gematria for Hebrew. Gematria for Hebrew is where all of this originated from, of course. Hebrew and the Judaic religion are where Kabbalah comes from to begin with. The English Cabalah, I am still really immersing myself in when it comes to the book itself, but when it comes to the English tradition of having a Kabbalah that is in English and is Christian, that would be C Kabbalah. And do I prefer this as opposed to Q Kabbalah or K Kabbalah? Personally, I don't really have a preference for any of these three because, well, for one, since I don't practice Judaism, so I don't really have a horse in the race when it comes to K Kabbalah, and I can't really judge whether or not it's the best or not. I think logically it would make sense that K Kabbalah would have primacy, considering that, well, just considering everything. I'm just going to put it at that. But C Kabbalah is an interesting can of worms because it's not always about what you consider to be like the recent version of Christianity. The C Kabbalah is something that was being invented all the way back to like the Renaissance era. C Kabbalah is largely being developed during Imperial Britain's reign, so you're really looking more to like the late 1600s or mid 1700s is when you really start to see, I think, what we now think of whenever we think of C Kabbalah or English Cabalah. So this book is basically on that, but it's an older book. Let me see when this is from. 1980. So this came out a year before I was born. This is the second printing, which was in 1993. And to give you an idea of what you're walking into, first page here, dedicated to all the teachers of the Great White Way who have assisted in the dissemination of the material contained herein, and especially to that illuminated one known to the writer as Rebaumaus Tate, the scribe. And that's his own in joke. I don't know anything about it. This is typical stuff that you get from this particular set. This is going to be fairly Masonic in nature. In fact, most of the stuff in here just outright labels itself as Masonic. So that doesn't leave any mystery there. Hey, look, it's the Temple of King Solomon. You don't get much more Masonic than that. But one thing that I've been interested in is the mathematics of Kabbalah and how it relates to actual scientific development and the actual development of math. And this is where I think that this book is going to come in a lot of handy, because I was specifically wondering about the Manhattan Project, and look, it's a bomb. I don't know if it's a bomb literally, but part of the point of the work that they do with gematria in this English Kabbalah is that they have these arrangements of letters that turn out to either spell English words, or if you say them out loud, like, the letter C, the letter U, see you, or you see, like that kind of pun type of thinking is how it ends up working. So this means that the Hebrew approach to Kabbalah is entirely different than the English approach to Kabbalah as described and written here, because you cannot directly translate that kind of stuff in Hebrew to this kind of stuff in English. This is an entirely new kind of thing that's made up. It's not just adapting, it's like new Kabbalah. This is a new product of spiritualism and mysticism. It is not just a translation of something that's in another language. And I respect that approach, but I don't respect what was done to the Jewish people throughout, like, history. So, I'm here for the math. Math is also a field that has largely been dominated by white alpha males. So it's not surprising that I'm going to find it here in this white-ass Kabbalah book. But I want to show what is in here, because this kind of, like, very nerdy information, this numbers stuff, it's not very popular to talk about in magic and the occult, because numbers are considered fairly boring. And these little letter puzzles and stuff are also considered very boring. But here we have a guide to the English alphabet and its correspondences to tarot trumps or different tarot cards. And this is taking the work with the Hebrew alphabet that is directly tied to Kabbalah. You have the Hebrew letters being the 22 paths on the tree, for instance. And now you're taking the letters of the English alphabet, but the letters between Hebrew and English are not one-to-one at all. They're very differently pronounced. They don't relate. They barely relate, because you can go up to Phoenician and then climb back down, I guess. But, like, you have to go deep into the history of the alphabet to find where they connect. And there's different numbers of letters in each alphabet, so it's not a one-to-one conversion again. This is all new stuff. But they're working a lot with mathematics. Now, there was something that there was a description of using spheres and stacking spheres into pyramids, and that's what I'm looking for now. Because if that is the case, if they're using the construct of stacking spheres into an actual volumetric space. Okay, here we go. So this right here, this is highly advanced mathematics. We look at it now as basic geometry, but at a certain point, this was mathematical secrets that, one culture knew and a whole bunch of other cultures didn't. And at one point, you didn't do a whole bunch of numbers to do math. You used shapes. You would take that, the different squares there, and you'd be able to use the math associated with those squares to be able to figure out the perimeter of those triangles. You'd use all these different math rules to be able to make it work. And I mean, you've seen magic squares before. If you've seen magic squares before, it's just like a grid full of numbers. Magic is numbers, and magicians are constantly associated with, these really cool looking shapes. People look at this and they think it's magic, and the magic is simply that there's a trick that you use to be able to get big numbers out of this and calculations for geometry and architecture. The Romans and the Greeks built buildings that have lasted to today, and part of the reason why they've lasted to today, probably the biggest reason why they've lasted till today, is because they understood the math behind architecture well enough to build something that could stand over time. The stress accumulated in the weight of the building wouldn't stress it over time to where it would crumble under its own weight. The only reason why, we've got buildings like in ruins in the ancient Greece areas is because of bombs from wars. If it weren't for people dropping bombs on these things, then they'd still be looking very similar to what the Greeks and Romans saw, save for the paint jobs and the precious metals. So, that was a bit of a tangent, but basically, if you knew advanced math, you could do societally important things. You could win a war. Knowing the right math was how you could win a war a lot of times, and it still is. It was a big part of how World War II was won, because they had to work out the math to build the bomb, figure out nuclear fission, figure out explosive nuclear fission. So somewhere in here, it started showing some kind of mathematical trick. Here we go. The Great Pyramid of the Emperor, a pyramid of spheres. It talks about gravity and all kinds of interesting things. Now, there's gematria for this and all, but what I'm going to be studying very soon is, does this at all relate to calculus? Because they're stacking spheres into a pyramid-shaped volume. That would actually be a way of trying to measure a space that you couldn't otherwise accurately calculate measurements for. You fill it with spheres, and then you take those spheres, and if it's a volumetric solid, you can just dump all those spheres into a tub of water and then measure the water that's displaced. And that's one way to get a measurement of an area. But you can actually take that a step further with modern calculus. They have numerical tricks to be able to calculate this kind of problem much more accurately. Calculus is basically used to figure out all of these areas of spheres and circles and how to fit it all into a space and estimate something and kind of take that and scoot it over into another shape and figure out if that fits into that. The way that they used to do these kinds of calculations was that they used to just take different shapes and just arrange them around each other, slide this here, cut it in half to do the divide in half part of a mathematical problem, and then move it somewhere else, and then carry it back or move it around. So they would use shapes to transfer the math back and forth. And they would move around shapes to visually figure out the problems. So the numerical version of it, that's something that is pretty recent in terms of approaches. So you would have all these shapes around because you're already doing all of these, you're already trying to calculate all of these numbers with all these shapes that you already have. You could, easily do all kinds of things with that. But if everyone's already using shapes to calculate all of these equations in the past, then it's quite likely that the next mathematicians to try to figure out how to do that numerically would build on the work of the people in the past. They'd start by thinking, well, when you fill it with spheres of a certain size, then you get this number. What happens if you change the size of the spheres? Well, I don't have those sitting around. Maybe I'll figure out numerically. So it's kind of like looking at the heritage of mathematics and knowledge and civilization building in a way. I really think that the Kabbalah has stuff like calculus embedded in it, that there's probably tricks for how to do mathematics like calculus and other architecturally or masonically relevant types of calculations are probably in the Kabbalah. And I think they probably used it during the Manhattan Project. There were Jewish scientists in the Manhattan Project. That was a big part of how it was successful. And I think that part of the reason why it was successful is because they needed to have some kind of model for how to think about the world on a subatomic level, and that was something that people didn't have before. And I think that the concepts in Kabbalah specifically have this ability to think on different planes of existence, and I think that helped them think of what would happen at the subatomic level. Also, there's just there's a lot in the Tree of Life model that really is very relevant for physics. Before you have the the Tree of Life proper. Let me see if I can just get a. Can you show me the Tree of Life in this big book about Kabbalah? Or am I going to have to get out a different one? Because I do have a different one. I have to get out a different one. This is very interesting stuff. It's just not. None of this is really the Tree of Life. But I mean, just so you know, like, this book is really cool. But it's going to be nothing like anything you've ever worked with before, unless you are some kind of really advanced Mason, I guess. In which case, like, drop a comment and tell me all the things that you do in your advanced Masonry. I want to know. So, that's that. What I was going to talk about with Kabbalah is that there's 3 layers before you actually get to the Tree of Life. There's the Ein Sof, and the Ein Sof R. I have a poster on the wall that I kind of sketched out really sketchily that has that written. That's where I'm looking right now. And this is basically like the presence of the divine that exists before the world is being created. And since there's 3 stages to it, I think it might be analogous to the 3 stages, the 3 phases that the universe went through after the Big Bang, or as the Big Bang happened. Like, there were 3 different kind of phases where the universe was at a certain temperature, and then it cooled off a certain amount, and then it cooled off a certain amount and dispersed a certain amount. And I think that those could actually be analogous to those stages of matter before the Big Bang. And then after the Big Bang, you have the creation of the physical world as we know it. Actually, all levels of the world as we know it. I think that's really relevant because that time period right after the Big Bang, but before the universe cooled off, had a lot of physics happening that don't happen anymore. They can't happen anywhere else and in any other conditions. It's part of the things that we're trying to simulate with things like the LHC and any other kind of particle accelerators, is like you create these exotic particles that don't ever happen anytime else, and it tells you what might have happened, really what was going on during the very beginning of the universe, and therefore how the physics that we interact with right now were created in the first place. And I think that Kabbalah could have a lot to say about that, because I think Kabbalah already has had a lot to say about that. I think Kabbalah has actually been pretty fundamental in how they developed things like the Standard Model. If you take a look at the Standard Model and look at the amount of reflectivity that's in it, it really reminds me of a lot of the structures that you find within the Tree of Life whenever you start really studying it. There's all these different ways that it can reflect on different axes. There's all kinds of different like reflection mechanics. The other thing I wanted to talk about is let me get a different book, because that's the one thing I'm really good at, is getting a different book. There's not a whole lot of books on the Qliphoth. That's the evil Kabbalah. They call it the Tree of Death. The Kabbalah, or the Qliphoth, are basically the husks of the spheres of the Tree of Life that were left behind after creation. That's one of the explanations. Some of Kabbalah states that the Qliphoth doesn't exist, that there can be no such thing as the Qliphoth because creation is inherently of God, and therefore you wouldn't have remnants that are not of God. But if we look at this from the standpoint of math, instead of from the standpoint of what cool little beings might be called up mystically from these strange little diagrams. If I look at this chart of the Qliphoth from the standpoint of mathematics, and I try to start from there, which is basically what I've been doing. The first thing that I notice is that there's really no difference between the Qliphoth and the Sephiroth. Like, they're pretty much the same structure with different names and with a demon assigned to each thing. And it's not quite what I would expect, but that means that the fundamental difference between the two is that the Sephiroth, like each Sephira, has it's a sphere and it has something in it. I know that they are emanations, but the spheres of the Sephira, there are actually a sphere that corresponds with each, and sometimes they're considered to be the actual planetary spheres, the planets. I think that there's the possibility that the Sephiroth is a bunch of spheres that are like volumetric solids. They have volume. They're solid inside, just like our planet. It's solid through and through. It has a liquid core, but that's a solid. It's there's no air in there. It's not hollow. But I think that might mean that the Qliphoth, they're hollow. I mean, they're supposed to be husks or shells. If they're shells or husks, then they're hollow. Well, where the math comes in is that might mean that the Sephiroth math is for calculating volume. Like there might figures that have more to do with volume, or solids that have volume to them, and the Qliphoth might have to do with calculating surface area. So basically you have the volume inside of something, like what is the volume inside of something, and then you have what is the surface area of the thing, what's inside and what's outside. That's pretty sensible. So I don't think that these are the only things that the Qliphoth and the Sephiroth hold, but I think that there are probably mathematical tricks that one could do if they knew the right keys that are buried in the Tree of Life and the Tree of Death. And I think that you could use it to do calculus and other math. And I wish I knew much more math personally. I kind of floundered my way through trig, and that's about as good as I got whenever it came to math, and I don't remember much of it. So I'm not sure how equipped I feel for this journey sometimes, but I think that if I just kind of keep reading through the mystical books, I'll find what I'm looking for. Reading through math books is actually like reading demonic grimoire in terms of the fear it makes me feel. Math books are I'm really joking, but the diagrams in math books look a lot more mystical than the diagrams in magic books, in my opinion. It's a lot harder to read them, and I think it would take a lot longer to do the mystic ritual to summon the number it's supposed to give you in the end. So, that's the English Cabalah. That's my journey to find the math in the Tree of Life. Cheers.